Okay, there we go. I look like I have a giant head.
That's all right. I actually have a giant head, so.
Nope. Don't play.
You got a microphone too there, buddy. Don't use
I
that.
know. It's fine. Testing, testing. That's loud.
See, it just can't not be a journalist.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to do this for a second. I'm going to give folks like 30 more seconds. You can pass them down maybe. We can get some public participation on that side. Grab someone's Post-its from over here, put them on the wall for them. There we go. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Does anyone else need some time? Perfect. Sparkling water. It always surprises me in Europe. Everyone drinks sparkling water. Okay. Samir, thank you. Anybody else? We're good? Cool. I'm going to switch to this mic down here. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is the panel on public media in the 21st century. I need to remind myself, and it's also right here. Thank you so much for coming. We really, really appreciate you being here. We're going to make this as participatory session as possible. We're going to get to the introductions from the panelists and myself in a moment. But first, I sort of want to lay frame the conversation for us today in a couple of different ways. The first one is to tell you why we're here. Public funding is changing in a lot of different places, in a lot of different ways. We have a handful of folks here with us who are sort of experiencing this, practicing this, but this is certainly not the only people in the room who are doing this. And I also encourage you to think about public funding in relation to quasi-public funding like cooperatives and membership models, right? These are all conversations around public funding, and we couldn't have them all on the panel here today, but the ones we do have I think are really important to highlight. Some basic agreements for the way we're going to be today. We like to practice at the Community Information Cooperative, equitable process, a good collective process. So we like to lay out basic agreements when we get started in conversations. I'm just going to run through these really quickly. One is one person speaks at a time. That's super straightforward. The second one is no one knows everything. Together we know a lot. So because I'm the one speaking right now and facilitating doesn't really mean much, right? I don't necessarily have all the information that you might be looking for, but together we do. Move up is a great one because it's an opportunity for all of us to advance today in the next hour we have together. What that means is totally move up. You could actually move up and take up seats in front of me. But what that also means is if you are someone who speaks very often, who's always taking up space in the room, maybe it's an opportunity for you to sort of move up and learn to listen more. And if you're someone who's shy, timid, doesn't like to have their voice heard, here's an opportunity for you to move up and have your voice be heard. We can't be articulate all the time. It's an excuse for me to ramble on and be like, you know what, I don't even know what I'm saying anymore, and just stop and say, we can't be articulate all the time. Be aware of the time is super important for me and for you. Is this room okay? There's like an echo. I just want to make sure I can hear myself down. Be curious is great. So if you hear something today that like makes you angry, like lean into that. Be curious about it. What would it look like for you to have that opinion and explore it more? There's a difference between intent and impact is also really important because it lets us sort of understand that our best intentions might have bad impacts and vice versa, and something to sort of think about when we go through these conversations. This is the agenda, also an important part of sort of effective collective process is make sure we're all informed about what we're going to be discussing today. The first is why we need to rethink public funding, then what trust looks like, and then we're going to discuss some paths forward. And along the way, I really hope that we're going to be able to have a conversation about this, and you'll see how we do that in a moment. So our roles in this is as conveners and facilitators and educators. We are sort of, the goal is to sort of set aside our ego and present things as they are so that you can learn from them. Your role is super, super important too. I really want to emphasize the two-way relationship we have in this room here today. This panel's going to be shit if you don't participate. So let's get to it and let's participate and let's really have a conversation. Hand raisers, note takers, process watchers, timekeepers, vibes watchers. These are all the roles you, the public, play in conversations about public funding. And now let's do introductions. My name is Sam Galperin. I'm the director of the Community Information Cooperative. What's that?
So these are very big pictures of our heads.
These are very, very giant pictures. I was like, I want to make sure people can see everything. It's fine. We'll move away from the slide in a couple of minutes.
Thanks, Simon.
I'm the director of the Community Information Cooperative. We are a nonprofit specializing in advocating for public participation in local information ecosystems. What that means is that we advocate for new hyperlocal funding models. And we also work with local governments and community organizations to help them sort of power up their existing engagement. Our premier initiative is the Community Information District. It is based on a model that exists in the United States called the Special Service Districts. It's how communities fund public services like fire departments, water, sanitation in the United States. So we are taking that same model and using it as a way to fund hyper-local news and information, sort of aiming specifically at news deserts and places where market-based models for news don't work, and creating alternative funding mechanisms through the public, and also creating alternative accountability mechanisms through that same process. I'd like to go down the panel now. Karen, feel free to get started. I'm going to go over there and grab those Post-it notes so we can begin planning to include them in the conversation.
Do you want me just to go right into the 2-minute history of, okay. So here I'll give you just a 2-minute history of public funding in Canada. Most of it is recent. So historically we had the CBC that's been funded and most recently up till about $7 million annually. They're very much like the BBC, which you'd be familiar with. In Canada it was felt that we needed to have a strong public broadcaster. First of all, because of the geographical distances and the problem with infrastructure that Canada has, that really a private company wouldn't be able to effectively do it. And then secondly, because we're so close to the US. And so in terms of news and information, people will want their own, but there was a lot of concern over Canadian culture and protecting Canadian culture from just American culture moving in and overtaking Canada, which happens a lot on the private stations. We love our American television. So CBC has a mandate not just for news, but also for cultural programming such as drama and comedy as well. I work at APTN. We are not publicly funded. We were the first Indigenous broadcaster to be set up in the world. I'll talk a little bit maybe later about our highly unique way of funding ourselves in Canada. It's a little bit complicated. But like everything else right now, everything's in shift, and our model is also shifting as well, and will probably fail in the next 10 years. So we're in the same position as everybody else where we're trying to figure out what comes next. The big concern in Canada was about newspapers and the failing of the business model, the advertising model that used to support them, which seems to be a big theme. It's interesting to hear, because we usually are really preoccupied with Canada and the US. It's really interesting to hear how broadly across the world this is impacting everybody. So the government made first the government commissioned a study 2 years ago, and it resulted in a bunch of recommendations or thoughts for government interventions. The first was to invest, and this was announced in the 2018 budget, $50 million to support local news in underserved communities, with local news being hit the hardest and being the most cut back. And that's supposed to be over 5 years. So the reaction from the industry was two things. What do you mean government's going to fund local news? There's a lot of problems with the implications of this. And the second was, well, that's not enough. So you had the two. You can just predict if you put journalists in the room and start these conversations that there's going to be as many journalists as there are in the room, there's going to be as many different points of view. So in the recent budget, in November they did sort of a pre-budget announcement where they said they were going to put $595 million into supporting newspapers. And we didn't really have the details on that until the budget was just announced about a month ago. And so what they're going to be doing is a 25% refundable tax credit on labor, up to $13,750 per employee. I brought cheat notes just to make sure that I got the numbers right. And there's a salary cap about $55,000. You must be a majority-owned Canadian paper. You must be presenting Canadian news in Canada. It must be general news. This will not apply to people doing specifically entertainment or sports. There's also going to be non-refundable tax credits up to 75% for subscribers on digital publications. So just to give you an idea, Canada has a small media because we've got a small population, but we did lose 260 news outlets in a decade, and only 9 startups opened up to replace them. This money is very much meant for large newspapers and large newspaper chains, and they've welcomed, I think, what's been announced. There's been some questions about how it will be distributed, with the government appointing a panel of journalists, or appointing a panel to appoint a panel of journalists, because people felt like it had to be very arm's length, and there'll be some decision made about who actually qualifies and gets the money and who doesn't. And there's some concerns over how close that might be to government, or if there would be interference. And finally, the digital startups feel like this has created unfair competition for them because they're moving into the space with new business models. And by funding the legacy models, they feel that the government's propping up a model in favor of their startup. And I think that's the synopsis.
Can you tell us a little bit about APTN?
Sure. So APTN it's not government funded, but it was created as a creature of government in a way. What happened is there used to be a TVNC, which was a northern broadcaster that was publicly funded. And it got too expensive and government basically didn't want to do it anymore. At the same time, there was a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, and it made several recommendations to government, one of which was that Indigenous people should have their own media. And so a proposal was created to end TVNC and take some of the infrastructure and resources that were up in the northern part of Canada, add it to some southern resources, and have a coming together where you'd form this broadcaster. Now, the way that it's funded, it has a broad mandate. It has a CBC-sized mandate. It has to produce drama. It has to produce comedy. It has to produce news. It has to produce current affairs. It has to produce documentaries. So it's a very large mandate. And the way they fund is that we have a regulator, the CRTC, and it gets to decide, or it gets to force our cable companies to carry certain channels. So they tell them, you must carry, we are a must carry, you must carry APTN. And then they tell them how much they must pay us. So every 5 to 7 years, depending on the length of our license, the CRTC renews our mandate and says, you're doing a good job here, but now you must add some things to your mandate. And then we renegotiate how much money we're getting. So it's been going up. But of course, we have the same issue that I think everybody in broadcast is looking at, which is people are cutting their cable. So this main source of income for us is going to be cut. Slowly, as people cut their cable, there just won't be as much money there for us to support ourselves. We have a secondary stream of income through advertising, but because of the small population we serve and where they're located, they tend to be located in places where they don't measure eyeballs, and so we tend to have very low numbers for advertisers. So advertisers always been a secondary revenue for us.
Thank you. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming today to hear us talk about new models for public funding. It's really great to be here. And thanks, Simon, for being this panel. So I'm Mike Rispoli. I work for an organization called Free Press in the United States. Free Press is a national media and technology advocacy organization that fights for just and equitable media. So what does that mean? We do a lot of organizing and policy work around issues like net neutrality, broadband access, the digital divide. And I run their local journalism project called News Voices. And we launched News Voices in the state of New Jersey in 2015 as a way to bring communities into the conversation about the future of local news. And you know, in the States at least, a lot of the conversations about the future of local news were going on at journalism conferences like these. They were going on inside of newsrooms. No one was actually talking to communities about what the impact has been with the loss of local news about civic engagement or finding out about issues that people care about. And so we convene events and run workshops to bring community members and journalists together to have them work on issues to build relationships. And while we were doing this work in New Jersey, we saw this really big opportunity. So New Jersey is sandwiched in between the New York and Philadelphia media markets in the United States, which means that local coverage has always really been local newspapers because the broadcasters were physically based in different places. And so with the downturn in print media consolidation, New Jersey was effectively one giant news desert, where there was about a 30% drop in newspapers over the course of 10 years, where thousands of journalists have been laid off and dozens of newsrooms had closed down. And so as we were doing this work, we were building relationships with people all around the state, and we were talking to them about what they would want to do in response to this growing news desert. And at the same time, the state of New Jersey was set to receive hundreds of millions of dollars from the sale of old public television licenses. And so we activated a grassroots campaign to make sure that a portion of that money that the state of New Jersey was about to receive was set aside to actually go back into underserved communities and communities of color and immigrant communities in New Jersey who are particularly underserved historically or by current media. And so we held 10 forums around the state of New Jersey in 2017. We spoke with newsrooms across the state. We talked with media experts and academics. And what we came up with was this idea called the Civic Info Bill. And what the Civic Info Bill does is create a publicly managed fund where anyone who lives in the state of New Jersey can apply for a grant to support an innovative local news and information project. So in some communities that may look like a digital startup, in other communities that may be civic technology or an open data platform or news literacy programs in local schools, training student journalists. The reason why we developed this idea was because what we heard from people all across the state was that even though the state had a history of dedicating money towards news and information, that was really only through TV and radio, and it was only English-speaking news. And it was news coverage that didn't necessarily represent communities of color in the state. And so we wanted to create something that really was responsive to specific community needs as opposed to just having public funding go to one single broadcaster. And so in 2017, we launched that campaign, and we were able to get legislation introduced in the New Jersey legislature to create the Civic Information Consortium, which is the publicly managed fund. And you know, what was really exciting was that thousands of people in New Jersey advocated for better media. Thousands of people attended forums. They wrote letters to their lawmakers. They wrote letters to the editor. They signed petitions. They made phone calls. They showed up to the State House to lobby for this. And so what was really exciting about this wasn't just this different idea for how public funding can be used to support news and information, but we actually did a lot of community engagement and organizing to get people activated to support journalism, to support the future of news in their community. And so the legislation was introduced in 2017. It ultimately didn't pass, but what was fantastic was that the lawmakers in Trenton, and I don't think anyone would necessarily say that politicians are supportive of journalism, but they were responsive to their constituents, and so they reintroduced the bill in 2018, and the legislation passed with wide bipartisan support. And then the governor of New Jersey ultimately signed the bill. And so right now what we're doing is we're actively trying to create the infrastructure of this 501c3, which is going to be independent from the government but receive funding, like startup funding from the state of New Jersey. So we're currently right now helping create this thing. We're hoping that it'll be up and running in the next year or so. And the state of New Jersey is having a little bit of a disagreement about how much to fund it. It was originally supposed to be funded with a startup investment of $5 million. The governor first said, no, there's no money to do that. Then he said, well, maybe there's $1 million for it, but we've had legislative champions from the start who are going to continue to push for that original $5 million. And I think the one thing that's, I would just, like, we learned a lot throughout the course of this 2.5-year campaign that's still ongoing. I think the first thing that we learned is that people care about news and information. Maybe they don't care about journalism with a capital J, but people deeply care about what information they get in their community. They care very deeply about how their stories are told. And if newsrooms only view their audience as consumers, then they're missing out on how to get people activated to support their mission. And so I think what we've shown is that if you listen to people, if you're responsive to their needs, and if you give them a way to advocate for your job, for your work, for your industry, that they'll do it. We were, from the beginning of this, every single person, whether it was a lawmaker or whether it was a journalist, said, no one cares about journalism. This bill doesn't have any chance of happening. No lawmaker is going to sign in support of this. And I think what we've shown is that it's not only is it possible, but skepticism that is inherent in journalism is often its greatest inhibitor from allowing people to reimagine what it could look like. And so what I really want people to take away from this campaign and our work isn't, you may not necessarily advocate for different public funding or different models. I mean, I think you should, that's why we're here. But I really want people to take away that it's important to be skeptical as a journalist, but if you want to get people invested in your work, and if you want to change the way that things are, you have to put that skepticism aside and allow for people to dream and participate in that reimagining of what local media can look like.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
Victoria, feel free.
Hi, thank you for coming. It's great to be here. My name is Victoria Brest. I am a journalist at the BBC, where I work on its local news partnerships project. This is a collaborative project between the BBC and the wider local news industry in the UK. It's been up and running for about a year now, since the beginning of last year. There's 3 strands to its work. The first is a bank of BBC video content that is available for our partners, the wider local news industry, to use online. The second is a data journalism centre of excellence that trains regional journalists in data journalism skills, and at the same time uses publicly available data sets to tell stories that are in the public interest, and similarly makes those stories available to the wider industry. The third strand, and the part of it that I work on, is called the Local Democracy Reporting Service. Now, this is a public service news agency that at full strength will have 150 reporters based all over the UK, where they are employed by the regional news organisations, often local newspapers, but they're paid for by the BBC. And these reporters have a very specific brief. They report on local democracy in their patch, and that includes local government, but it also stretches to other public authorities like the bodies that run the police and the fire service and the National Health Service at a local level. A big part of their job is taken up with reading the documents that local government produces, things like agendas and minutes, and going to the meetings so that they are in the room when the decisions are taken. Crucially, their content, the stuff that they produce, is then shared with all the partners. So it's available for their employers to use, as well as the BBC, but also for anybody else in their patch who's signed up to our partnership. And that can include competitor newspapers, it can include hyperlocal bloggers, and it can include commercial radio stations as well. So far we have just over 100 partners on board. They stretch from the biggest regional newspaper publishing companies in the UK. There's a big 3 who cover 75% of local newspaper ownership in the country, but it also includes things like sole trader hyperlocals, so really small independent outfits as well. Between them, they are responsible for about 850 titles. And so far, the 130 or so reporters who we have in post have produced more than 65,000 stories since the service got up and running early last year. The motivation behind the whole project is a sense that a democratic deficit was springing up because of the struggles in the local news industry. There's research from 2017 that says in the previous 10 years there had been a net loss of 300 regional newspaper titles in the UK, so that's a drop of about a quarter. And in the same period, the circulation of regional newspapers had fallen by 50%. So it's a familiar tale of falling revenues leading to closures and cutbacks and fewer reporters, and that in turn making it harder to cover time-consuming things like local councils, and then the scrutiny that those authorities were facing falling. Turning to the funding, it uses a long-established model of public funding in the UK, the BBC licence fee, but it uses it to pay for journalism specifically about local democracy and then to make that journalism more widely available. What's new about it...
That was Joanne Edith from Centre for Cooperative.
What's new about it is the collaborative aspect and the partnership working with the wider local news industry and the use of the licence fee to pay for a different type of journalism. My background is that I was a local newspaper reporter in the north of England for 8 years, and for 4 years of that as a local government reporter. I became one of the first local democracy reporters when the service got up and running early last year, and then 3 months later I moved to work on the BBC team. So I still work on the LDRS, but my job now is to promote its content to BBC outlets and to spot themes that are emerging from the stories across the country.
Thank you, Victoria. So this is like a really interesting cross-section of like the conversations are happening around public funding in different places. Canada, the state of New Jersey, and in the UK. So the next, come on, slideshow. The next question was going to be to the panel, but I feel like we sort of answered this, like why do we need to go beyond traditional public funding models for journalism and media? Layoffs, a precipice for the business, traditionally racist coverage that does not serve people of color and immigrant communities and non-English language speaking communities, places like New Jersey, just a deficit of local reporters, just like covering really important issues. So we already sort of talked about those, so I'd like to sort of go to the question for y'all, which is which of these issues are you facing? Like what have you heard so far that's resonating? And if we can do a mic around the room, that would be great. Yeah. So if someone would love to tell me like what you've heard here that you think is similar in your community, that'd be great. This is the part where you participate. There's no racist coverage where you're from. Raise your hand if coverage where you live, you know, is racist. Okay, there's a couple of hands. Okay, that's a really interesting thing, right, that we need to discuss. In public funding, if we're exploring like questions about public funding, we have to begin understanding how we serve folks. Mike, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I mean, even just beyond coverage that, you know, promotes patriarchy or white supremacy, I think the model why we were interested in a publicly managed fund is just the recognition that every community has different needs. You know, and that one single broadcaster or one single news outlet can't meet all of those people's needs. I mean, it's impossible. And in a state like New Jersey, it's a very small state, but it's very densely populated. It has 565 municipalities, has about 9 million people that live there. And so even though it's geographically very small, very, very diverse communities, different needs, lots of local government. And so when local community newspapers disappeared, that was a ton of local government that was getting absolutely no coverage. And even in communities that maybe weren't news deserts, they were more affected by essentially like ghost media outlets, like corporations owning local newspapers and essentially gutting them, and they still exist, but like no one actually produces local coverage. And so I think, the reason why we were attracted to this idea of a fund is that it's just a recognition that communities have different needs, and that, that there are people who historically have been gatekeepers of producing journalism, and that those gatekeepers, in some cases, had actively harmed communities. In some cases, just failed. Like the model of it just failed. And so, instead of investing more government money into those problematic things, why don't we see if we can use public funding to spur new things and hopefully spur new and innovative projects that do represent a whole variety of voices around the state.
Thank you for sort of pacifying the room after no one wanted to admit that their media back home might be racist. Yeah. Yes, question. Wonderful. There's a microphone coming to you. That'd be great.
Oops. Yeah. I heard your question, but if you want to ask it again, that's okay too.
Oh, what did I say? That's very loud. I'm interested to know what kinds of local government coverage you got after actually actively involving members of the community in that coverage and asking them what they wanted to know about.
Yeah, so I can better answer that question. That's kind of that's related to our work, but not necessarily related to this campaign, because the Civic Information Consortium hasn't started giving out money yet, so I can't speak to that impact. But so News Voices runs projects in New Jersey, North Carolina, and Philadelphia, and what we have seen is that the deeper types of relationships that we kind of help spark and facilitate allow for journalists to reach parts of the community that previously were unreachable or being actively ignored by newsrooms. And so, like, I can give you an example about some work that we've been doing in Charlotte, in North Carolina. There's a part of the city of Charlotte called Brooklyn, or used to be called Brooklyn, and that name had essentially been wiped out from. It's got a different name now, that community, and the people who had lived there had all left. The name of the town changed, or that section of the community changed, and people who used to live in that section told journalists at the Charlotte Observer, like, there's this whole history of the city that no one knows about because it's been wiped out. And the journalists went back into their coverage, and they saw that the Charlotte Observer actively played a role in gentrifying and then pushing people out of that community, and began calling it by its new name, but not its name it historically had been, which was called Brooklyn. And so those community members then worked with the Charlotte Observer to produce a 10-minute documentary about the history of this section of town. And what that allowed was that there were all these community and local government conversations about how can we better preserve the history of Charlotte as it's actively changing. And so you saw a lot of local lawmakers who were being held accountable for policies that they were pushing that were gentrifying or changing the city, who then kind of recognized that the history of the city is important. And so while we, as a politician, maybe we do want to promote development, but we also don't want to push people out or actively erase them. And so I think that, that's not like necessarily like a hard policy change that a lot of journalists look for in their coverage, but what that's kind of recognizing is that when community members work more closely with newsrooms, it can create stories that otherwise wouldn't have been told.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to move on to a question that on trust. Actually, somebody also asked this too. I'll read from this. I think there is a need to rebuild trust in media. I think there is a need for media to be independent and do the watchdog work on policymakers. I want to know how you would do this in public media. The conversation often is like, where does the money come from? And if it comes from government, does that mean strings are attached to it? And I'd love to open it up. I think, Karen, you have a really interesting perspective on it, given the community you serve. And then, Victoria, I'd love to hear about it as it relates to your work with commercial media.
So I mentioned that APTN was created out of 1996 Royal Commission on Indigenous People. Those of you who might be in the over 40 crowd along with me may remember, because it became an international story when in 1990 the government called in the army on a small community of Mohawks in Kanesatake. They wanted to develop a golf course. The city wanted to develop a golf course on land that the Mohawks said were theirs, and they said there was a burial ground. So they blocked it, and there was a standoff for about 90 days where they faced off with the army. Subsequent to that, there's been, there's usually about one a year. There's Gustafson Lake. There was Ipperwash, where it was a peaceful vigil by Indigenous people who wanted to take back a park that the government had confiscated during the wartime and then was refusing to give back. In that case, one man was severely beaten and another, Dudley George, was shot by police when they moved in. There would be an inquiry into that 10 years later, and that would determine that the police were wrong to shoot him. The media actually wasn't present for that, and that was another really interesting one because many of the media reported that Dudley George was armed when in fact he never was. They weren't present at the time, but they only went to the police as a source of information on that story for the follow-up. There's been Caledonia, there was Rexton, recently Utenastaten was a pipeline blockade. So in Canada, aside from one incident in 1970 involving Quebec, in the history of Canada, the only armed standoffs or armed conflicts where the state has called in the army or the police against its own people has been against Indigenous people, and it's always over land. So it doesn't have a lot of trust. And we were always happy to not be publicly funded because the CBC, when it does get pushback on Indigenous issues, that's the pushback that they get. Of course you're going to say that. Of course you're going to get it wrong. You're just an arm of the government. And so it was always important for us to be separate because of the community that we serve. The one thing that we have considered, or that we thought we could consider instead of having public funding, would be if there was, because the way we're funded through the cable companies, and we have to fulfill certain mandates for the broadcast and not for online. So one thing that we thought that we might be able to accept in terms of public funding is if it was a small amount as a startup for online, but if we knew that it wouldn't continue, so that there would be a cutoff point. So sort of like an infant industry argument for those of you who did economics back when I did it. The idea that you protect the industry just while it grows until it's able to stand on its own and find its own feet and find its own business model, and then the public funding would go away.
Victoria, do you want to speak on this?
Yeah, I'll try. The way that our partnership and the distribution model for the news that we produce work means that the trustworthiness of it is incredibly important, because once it's out there, and all the partners get it at the same time. So if there's even a kind of a grain of suspicion or a lack of trust anywhere in that in one story, then suddenly it's gone everywhere at once. That puts the bar very high, I think, in how trustworthy the stories we create need to be. I think we're probably in quite a fortunate position in that, like I said, we use this established model of public funding and the license fee, which is, it's familiar to people in the UK. It's existed for decades, and it has a fairly high approval rating on its own, and then the BBC itself has a fairly high trust rating as well as a source that people go to and in how they rate its trustworthiness. So I think that, that kind of puts us on the front foot already, but I definitely say that we can't underestimate how important it is that the news we're putting out there is trustworthy. And written into the kind of the contracts and the terms of the agreements that we have drawn up with the suppliers, the newspaper companies and the employers of these reporters, is that news needs to be fair, balanced and impartial, and that can't be overstressed. They are obviously working in commercial newsrooms generally, and they are not impartial environments, but our reporters need to be impartial, and that is that's something that takes work and it takes effort for the reporters to maintain and for us to maintain.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah. So, you know, in the United States, there's like a real strong suspicion around governments funding media, and you know, that's despite the fact that in the U.S. It's been in existence for 50 years. And so while the Civic Info Bill campaign was kind of creating something that doesn't exist in the States, a lot of journalists said, wait a second, government funding for media, that's preposterous, even though like it's been in existence for a very long time in the United States for 50 years, as well as existing in other places. I think the most important thing really is that is for journalists and people who are decision makers inside of newsrooms is to recognize that no matter where the money comes from, there is always a threat that that money will somehow influence the editorial product, right? This is true in commercial media. This is true for all the newsrooms who are super excited about all this big tech money, right? Like I'm wearing a Google lanyard and there's a Facebook booth in the Fani Hotel. No one's really questioning about whether or not that's ethical, right? But if it's government funding, then it's problematic. And I'm not saying that government funding can't be problematic. The most important thing is that there are safeguards in place that prohibit the interference of the editorial product. And I think that what we have seen is that the commercial model has not only failed from a market perspective, it has horribly failed from a community representation perspective. And I don't think that newsrooms are really in a position right now to really say that this money's okay and this money's not, because for a long time they made money off the backs of extracting information from communities and from misrepresenting communities of color, at least in the United States. They had no problem writing headlines or producing stories that promoted racist stereotypes and making money off of ads from that. And so I think that right now what we really need to be doing is figuring out all the different funding models that are possible, because I don't think that we're really in a position to say that it's only going to be one way.
Thank you for that. I think that, yeah, one moment. We're going to come over here next, just for the mic. But I just want to add to that, the way we think about trust building at the Community Information Cooperative is through participation and governance. So we think governance is twofold, right? Decision making, like who's on the board that makes large decisions, but also what are the day-to-day decisions being made, and how can we actually put those day-to-day decisions in the hands of regular people? So like what are tasks and roles that journalists do, and how can we actually sort of equip people, regular people, non-journalists to do them? The sort of shining example in the United States is with City Bureau and their Documenters program. They train, like they call them like highly engaged citizens. They think of themselves as sort of like a non-professional journalism corps, reporters corps, and they just go to document public meetings, and they are paid $15 an hour, which is not you know, it's considered a living. It's considered the bare minimum living wage in the States, but it's reasonable. It's reasonable for a high school kid, for a senior citizen, for people who have time to get involved in the community, and training them, incentivizing them to do that. So that's just so when we think about building trust, the key is to really sort of decentralize as much of the process as possible, so people can feel a part of it. There's a question right here in the front row.
I think it's true that there might be multiple funding sources. The question is how independent the content is, and that's actually my question, especially for our Canadian, but also BBC. How much does your public funding go into covering international news? Is that something that, because as we saw the business model falling apart, the first people who were fired were people who were working for foreign news agencies and in most of the media. And that has left foreign news not as independent. It's always depended on wire services. So does that fit in your kind of map? And does that also, the possibility of partnership with international organizations to kind of make it less expensive, whereas you can get, you know, authentic original news and yet from international sources? Does that fit into your funding model?
So Canada's answer might be very different from the BBC, so that's an interesting question. In the Canadian market, there is not a lot of international news. It's pulled off of wire services. They just slashed bureaus years ago. My understanding is reporters that do work in foreign bureaus are often just watching what other people are reporting on TV these days from Canada. And none of the money was really put in to bring that back. The concern was the local news that had shut down and local news deserts. I think in part of it is that Canada is a country where people feel really insulated, and they feel there's just not, it's just not a ratings getter to do international news. They're not as aware or as engaged, unless it's the US, in which case, especially right now, people are like watching it and eating popcorn. I mean, who isn't? But they use a lot of wire services. Yeah, no, perhaps, but that just wasn't the way the government funding went.
Yeah, I don't really know if I can answer your question truthfully, because the project that I work on and that we work on is very specifically targeted towards local democracy, and that's, you know, the other end of the scale to international news. And it was a problem. A kind of a declining coverage of local democracy was a problem that had been identified for a number of years and that had been talked about for a number of years before, in around 2014, the conversation started about how it could be addressed and what the solution might be, or what a solution might be. So, yeah, I think that's what I can speak to, really.
Thank you, Victoria. So I was asked to end 5 minutes early, so I'm going to respect time because it's one of our basic agreements. So we have 5 minutes left. Let me just see what here. So I definitely want to give folks on the panel the opportunity to sort of say like what somebody in the room should do next, like if they want to go home and do something, like what they should be doing. But I'd like to spend the last couple of minutes making sure that anyone who has any specific questions, make sure it has the opportunity at least to ask them. Does anyone have any questions in the room? Let's go over here and then we'll come to you. Yeah?
Hi, thanks very much for everything you've said. It is really inspiring. Sorry to be slow on the uptake with the response, but it's all good
That's
stuff.
Fine.
Thank you.
It's fine.
Yeah, I'm from the UK, as you can probably tell. I am the chief exec of a small community media news organisation. Mm-hmm. The thing I'm fighting really is my background is in NGOs and campaigning, as well as journalism. And whenever I broach this idea of kind of community engagement, just as you were mentioning earlier, Mike, establishment media editors hate that. They just seem to think that is completely biased. You cannot do it if you want to remain in the reporting that then follows. So I'm kind of trying to build a model which is like a hybrid of these things, but I just wondered what reflections you have around this and how far you can take it and what you would build in to kind of ensure that things remain impartial.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. It's a thing that a lot of we hear a lot, and you know, I think it's a legitimate question. You know, like I would disagree with that statement, but I understand that perspective certainly. And we're not a media outlet. Like we are an organizing advocacy like group, and so obviously our responsibility is in the communities that we work in. But what I always tell, you know, what I tell journalists or editors inside of newsrooms who bring up that community engagement can somehow possibly make them less impartial is that it's the job of a journalist to build relationships, and the relationships that you build influences the journalism that you produce. So if you're a journalist and all you do is cultivate relationships with people in positions of power, public information officers, people who own corporations in a community, then that's gonna change the way you do your reporting, because you're like the things that are important to them, the quotes that they give you, the information they give you, that's gonna skew your journalism. And ultimately, if you're trying to be a good community journalist and speak truth to power and hold powerful people to account, I don't see how cultivating relationships with people in the community who hold just as valuable of information, who have just as valuable, if not more valuable, perspectives and expertise, I don't see how that makes your journalism less impartial. If anything, it makes it more, because that means that you're talking to people who aren't as represented, or people who can actually talk about the real-world impact that policies are having. And so what we always tell journalists to do is, the people who hold information in a community are people like baristas, hairdressers, the older folks who sit on their porch and kind of watch like the community, go by and how it's changed. All those people hold information just like a public information officer would. And so if you want to produce journalism that's more responsive to the needs of a community, you actually have to go cultivate relationships with them, just like you would with people, with other folks. And sorry, the last thing I'll just say about that is that often too, like journalists will be like, I just don't have time to do that. Yeah, I understand like the pressures that you have under, but you still prioritize building relationships with people. It's fundamental to doing your work. And just like how you would call up a source at the local government's office and go out for a drink with them or go out for a coffee. You're not like looking for something from them, you're just maintaining that relationship. I always encourage journalists to do the same with people in your community. You don't want to just kind of recreate these transactional relationships with community members. You want to be able to make sure that you're building a really authentic relationship that's rooted in trust.
If I could just jump in, because I think it's just stick to those tenets: balanced, fair, transparent. For a long time in Canada, they would not hire Indigenous people to do Indigenous journalism because they said you're going to be biased. And what they were mistaken in bias was actual knowledge about the history and what was going on in the community. So it took us probably, we're 20 years old now, it took us probably the first 10 years to really establish that we were doing quality journalism. And there's been no question since. And we noticed that a lot of people are hiring Indigenous people to do Indigenous news now.
And then we have the last question. Thank you, by the way, Karen. As quickly as you can. I'm
yes,
sorry.
So I'm a political activist and video columnist in Lima, Peru. I'm studying in New York, and I'm taking a course on journalism, and one of the things that we were asking ourselves is whether there was public funding in media in Latin America, and intuitively our answer was no, because governments are not interested in making investigative journalists, let's say, journalism stronger, because they're more they have to be more accountable. So I was wondering, how does it work for the BBC? Like, how do you manage to get public funding without getting compromised, committed your editorial line, the independence of your editorial line? And what do you think is what people value in the BBC to be trustworthy and for them?
Finish us off, Victoria.
Yeah, wow. I think the answer to that lies in the way the BBC funding works, and that it doesn't come directly from the government. It comes from the licence fee structure, which is something that individuals or households pay, and it goes specifically for the funding of the BBC. So in that way, it's not directly underwritten or paid for by the government. And as I touched on earlier, it's been around for decades, and don't misunderstand me, it's not universally loved by any stretch, but it's established, and it generally has fairly high approval ratings. Does that answer your question? Yeah, good. Okay.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you. Thanks, y'all. Take care. Of course.